I'm David Handley with the University of Maine Cooperative Extension, and we're here to talk about planting raspberries. Now, I like to plant raspberries in the early spring as soon as you can start working the soil up, but any time before the middle of June is usually fine here in Maine. Ideally, usually mid to end of May is a good time. When you're thinking about selecting a site for raspberries, you want to pick a site that's nice and open because raspberries like full sunlight. The soil type should be well drained. Raspberries will tolerate a wide range of soil types as long as they don't have wet feet. So make sure you're not putting them in a spot where the water stands during the springtime. If you do have a heavy soil that doesn't drain very well, one of the things you can do is plant your raspberries in a raised bed. It doesn't require much. You just need to pick the bed up about 6 to 8 inches, and you want your bed to be about 2 feet wide. If you don't need to do that, then planting on bare ground is just fine. It's best to have a soil test done the year before planting. You can pick up a soil test kit at the University of Maine Cooperative Extension office closest to you, and we have a video on that on this website. Now, there are 2 types of raspberry plants you can buy easily. Typically, when we order plants from a nursery, a mail order nursery, this is what we're going to get. These are dormant canes, often called handles for short, and we have a segment of a 1-year-old cane. This was a green shoot that grew up last spring. The nursery dug it up in the fall and then stored it and ships them out in the springtime, and it has a good bit of root on it. We like to see at least 10 inches of root system on there. These roots are going to spread out, and eventually we'll get buds from these roots, which will spring up and give us our new shoots that will fill out the row for us. Also, at some garden centers you can buy raspberry plants already growing and potted for you. These are fine also. It's a more expensive way to go, especially if you're planning on putting in a lot of raspberries, but if you just want a few and you want them to be up and growing right away, this can work. This also allows you to plant later. So if you're getting into June or July, it's hard to find dormant plants then, this may be the way to go. We want to work the ground up, and we want to incorporate our fertilizer prior to planting. So based on what your soil test is telling you, you work in your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and if your soil is a little bit heavy, a little too much clay, not draining particularly well, you may want to work in some organic matter like some compost or some peat moss just to work it up. Your soil pH should be at between 5.8 and 6.2. Your soil test will tell you that. If you're running a little bit acid, you want to work some lime into the soil to bring that pH up to where the raspberries will like it. Now, our spacing on raspberries when we're getting ready to plant, we want to space them about 2 feet between plants. Anywhere between 18 and 28 inches is just fine. I like to go with 2 feet. And what we want to do is be able to bury these deep enough so that the soil comes to just about where they were in the nursery or just a little bit deeper. This isn't going to require a very deep hole. Raspberries are very shallow rooted. Most of the roots are in the top 6 to 8 inches of the soil. But we want to dig the hole wide enough that we can put these roots in without binding them up or forcing them to bend upwards. So you can see here, we've got a nice hole all set, ready to go here. Not that deep. We just want to spread the roots out and work our soil back in. No fertilizer in the planting hole. If we put fertilizer in the planting hole, we're likely to burn those roots. This is why I say incorporate the fertilizer prior to planting and prior to digging your holes. Then we just backfill with our soil just up and firm that soil around just up to where it was at the nursery or slightly deeper. It's always good if you leave a slight depression, not a hole, just a slight depression around the plant such that when it rains, that water will collect there and not run off away from the plants, but collect there and then drain down and keep those roots nice and moist as we enter the growing season. Now, your next plant should, as I said, be about 2 feet away. This looks awfully far apart, but one of the things that you want to remember is that the buds from these roots are going to spring forth with new growth and fill out the space between these plants. If you have a really long root system that's making it difficult for you, don't be afraid to prune a little bit of the root off. That's not going to hurt the plant any. And if it makes planting easier for you, you can trim a little bit of that root off. Just make sure you're not pruning more than 25% of the length of the root off, because then you're probably going to be hurting the plant. When it comes to using a potted plant, it's pretty much the same thing. We just need to dig the hole deep enough and wide enough to accommodate the pot. We just gently tap that raspberry out of the pot and take a look at the root system. Now here, this looks great. The roots aren't terribly pot bound. If you have a lot of roots that are winding around the plant like this, those can actually choke off the plant because they won't grow outwards. They tend to keep growing inwards. So if you see that, don't be afraid to get your hand in there and loosen up those roots a bit, so that will force them to grow out a little bit. Don't try to break the roots, but just try to loosen them up a bit so that they're not growing around the pot and choking the plant. Then again, just like we did with the other plants, we want to plant this just a little bit deeper than the top of the pot was. And push it down to make sure you're getting good contact of the soil with those roots. And you don't want to leave, whatever you do, don't leave the top of that root ball sitting out of the soil, because that acts like a wick. And if that root ball is sticking out from the soil, the air will dry it out very quickly, and the plant will go drouthy. The other thing that will happen is these plants will frost heave when that happens. You'll find the plant pushed out of the soil the following spring after it's been exposed to frozen soil over the winter. But again, just leave a little depression around it so that water collects there, not a deep bowl, just a slight depression. And that plant's ready to go. Now, if you want more than one row of raspberries, you need to put in a second row. And one of the most common mistakes people make is to plant that second row too close to the first row. You need a minimum of 8 feet between your rows. As you see here, this is actually about 10 feet between the rows. And the reason for that is the new canes are going to grow up. They're going to get quite tall. They may be over 6 feet tall. When they get laden with fruit, they branch out and lean out. And it becomes very difficult to get down between these rows once the fruit is there and you have to get into harvest. Remember, most of these things have thorns, so it's not fun to try to wade your way through them. Also, by having this much space between the rows, we allow for plenty of light to come down and keep the plants dry, and we allow for plenty of air movement between the plants also to keep them dry, and this will prevent cane diseases from occurring. So give them the space that they need. If you plant them too tight, you'll regret it later. Once these plants start growing this summer, we're going to have new shoots coming up from the base and also new shoots coming up from in between the plants to fill out this plant row. We don't want to allow those new shoots to come out any wider than a foot on either side, so that your total row width at the base is going to be about 2 feet. The row width gets wider than that, the plants in the middle are getting shaded out, and that's where you'll have cane diseases and fruit rots developing. So if you have new shoots developing out here, just cut them off. We don't need them, they're just causing trouble. Now, once the plants are in the ground, we want to put a little water in there to set those roots nice for us. Also, if you're using the live growing plants, we need to make sure that these get a good drink to get established, because if the soil's dry, it will dry those roots right out. So again, notice that we put that little depression around there so it's collecting water. We want to pour enough on so it's going to get down to that root system where we need it. And we're going to do this to each plant we can. Or you can just set up a soaker hose or a sprinkler to give them about 1 inch to 2 inches of water right after planting. And again, with the potted plant, we just want to make sure there's enough water getting in there that we can soak that root system nicely. If these plants start to wilt, you know you need to put more water on there. And after you've watered, just go back and double check and make sure you've planted that plant deep enough that the top of the pot, or where the pot was, isn't showing where that plant went in. Once we've got the plants in the ground and we've watered them all in, now we can put a mulch on top of them. This mulch will help keep the soil moist, and it will help prevent weeds from growing. Any type of material that would typically be used for mulching a perennial crop would do just fine. Bark mulch, for example, is good, tends to be a little bit expensive. Wood chips or shavings also work pretty well. Sawdust tends to be too fine a particle, so when we have sawdust over time, it tends to compress and compact and becomes very difficult for water to percolate down through it. That's why I prefer shavings or wood chips, to make sure that it's porous enough that the water can come right through there. And you can check that by just after putting 3 or 4 inches of mulch over the top of these, pour a little water over them and just stand there and watch and make sure that the water percolates down nicely. And press it down a little bit so it won't blow away, and you're good to go. Now, if you've got a whole bunch of pine needles you want to use, those make a fine mulch too. We don't use them commercially because it's hard to get enough of them, but they'll work just fine. People worry that they acidify the soil, but they don't acidify it very fast, and you can always make up for that by putting a little lime over the top when your soil test tells you to do that. And that's pretty much it. The other important thing we need to do is to set up a trellis, because when these plants start to grow, they're going to need support next year when they start to fruit. You can see a good example of a trellis in our pruning video, and that will give you some hints as to how best to support these canes once they start growing. It doesn't have to be done right away. You can wait till the late summer or fall or even next spring to set up that trellis, but this is how to plant them. Just bear in mind at some point they're going to need some support. The other important thing to remember when you're siting your raspberries is try not to plant them where there are a lot of wild raspberries around, because wild raspberries have a lot of diseases and those can spread on to your new healthy raspberries. So if you've got a lot of wild ones around, it's best to prune them out or cut them out prior to planting your raspberries. Well, that's it. Go plant some raspberries.